The evening Miss Cranbourne struck Daphne Darrow's name from the household staff list. She did it with a single word to the Duke's steward, and the steward passed it along to Mrs. Garwood, and Mrs. Garwood told the cook, and the cook told Daphne. "You're not needed tonight," Mrs. Garwood had said that morning, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than cruelty. "Miss Cranbourne prefers a reduced staff for the reception. Too many faces," she says. Daphne had thanked her. She had walked back up the narrow servants' staircase to the small room at the end of the east corridor, the room that had once been her mother's sitting room before the estate was sold, before the solicitor's letter arrived, before she had run out of options and invented a woman named Miss Darrow to take her place. And she had sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the wallpaper. She knew the wallpaper. She had chosen it at 16, pale green, with small ivory birds repeating in rows. Her mother had let her pick it from a catalog on a rainy afternoon, the last summer before everything began to change. Ravenscroft Hall had been in her family for 4 generations. Her father, the late Baron Ravenscroft, had left it to her in good faith, or so she had believed until his cousin Gerald produced a codicil no one had seen before, and the solicitors shrugged, and the estate passed out of her hands before she fully understood what was happening. By the time she engaged her own legal counsel, she was already out of funds. The case stalled. Gerald sold the hall within the year to settle his own debts, and the buyer had been Everard Thornley, the Duke of Thornley, who paid a fair price and moved in the following spring, and apparently never thought to ask whether the title was clean. She had a document that answered that question. She had obtained it from her father's original solicitor 2 years ago, an affidavit confirming that the codicil had been signed 3 weeks after her father's recorded death, in handwriting that did not match his trembling late-life hand. It was enough. Any competent barrister would have said it was enough. She had not used it. She was honest with herself about why. She had come to Ravenscroft in the autumn of the previous year, half out of desperation and half out of some stubborn need to see the place once more, and she had arrived to find the east wing, the crumbling, neglected east wing her father had never managed to restore, opened up and cleaned, and given over to use as a village schoolroom. The Duke had done this within 6 months of taking possession. He had not announced it publicly. There was no plaque, no ceremony. The village schoolmaster had mentioned it in passing to the cook, who had mentioned it to Daphne. She had sat with that information for a long time. Using the affidavit would have unwound the sale. It would have embarrassed the Duke publicly, cast doubt on titles held through associated purchase, cost him something he had evidently used well. She had told herself it was practicality. She was still telling herself that, but honesty, which she could not seem to stop practicing even when it was inconvenient, said something quieter. It would have required her to become someone willing to destroy a school for the sake of legal satisfaction, and she was not sure she was willing to be that person. So she had stayed. She sewed hems and mended curtains and kept her eyes down, and no one looked at her closely enough to recognize anything. She had been nobody. She had become good at it, in the way people became good at things they had no choice but to master. The note arrived at 4:30, slipped under the door of the former sitting room while she was rethreading a needle. No envelope. A folded square of cream paper, heavy stock, written in a hand she recognized immediately. "Come to the front entrance at 8. I will collect you myself. Wear the earrings. A.P. Lady Augusta Pelham." Her mother's oldest friend, godmother by association if not by record, the most formidable woman in 3 counties, and entirely aware of it. Daphne had not spoken to her in over a year. She had not told Augusta where she was. She should have known Augusta would find out anyway. Augusta made it her particular business to know where everyone was. Daphne read the note twice. Then she folded, put it in the pocket of her gray working dress, and sat for a long time looking at the pale green wallpaper. She thought about the evening ahead, the Duke's engagement reception. 30 guests expected. Miss Felicity Cranbourne in whatever gown she had commissioned for the occasion, standing beside Everard Thornley in the drawing room that had once been Daphne's favorite room in the house, receiving congratulations from people who had not thought to question how the estate had passed out of Ravenscroft hands. She thought about what it would mean to walk in through the front door. Then she thought about the earrings. Her mother's pearls, the only thing she had kept. She had sold everything else, the bracelet, the garnet brooch, 2 rings, to fund the legal counsel that had come to nothing. She had kept the pearls because they were small and because her mother had worn them every day, and because some losses were too particular to be practical about. At 7:30 she took them from the cloth pouch at the bottom of her traveling case. She put them on. She looked at herself in the small square mirror above the washstand. The gray dress was plain and slightly too large. The earrings were out of keeping with it entirely. She did not change the dress. She was not pretending to be more than she was. She was simply wearing what belonged to her. Augusta's carriage arrived at 8:08. It was a substantial vehicle, well appointed, the Pelham crest on the door. Augusta herself was inside, dressed in dark plum, with the posture of a woman who had decided in her 30s that she was done being invisible and had not revisited the decision since. She looked at Daphne's gray dress. She looked at the earrings. She said nothing about either. "You came," Augusta said. "Your note didn't read like a request," Daphne said. Augusta's mouth twitched. "It wasn't meant to. Sit down." They rode in silence for a moment. The front of Ravenscroft Hall was lit from every window, the gravel drive lined with the carriages of 30 guests. "He doesn't know," Daphne said. "No," Augusta said, "but he should. That's why we're here." Daphne looked out the window at the lit entrance, the footmen at the doors, the sound of voices, and something being played on the pianoforte she had learned on at the age of 8. "You could have told him yourself. You didn't need me here." "I need you standing in the room," Augusta said precisely. "That's different." The carriage stopped. Augusta descended first, with the unhurried ease of a woman who had attended several hundred such evenings, and had long since stopped being impressed by any of them. She offered her hand to Daphne. This was unusual. Augusta did not typically offer her hand to anyone. It was a statement, and they both understood it as one. They walked up the front steps together. The entrance hall, her father's entrance hall, with the oak paneling her grandfather had brought from London, and the staircase banister she had slid down at 7 years old and been caught by the housekeeper, was warm with candlelight and arranged with autumn flowers in vases she did not recognize. As they stepped fully into the drawing room, Daphne heard it. Not a silence exactly, but the specific alteration of attention that moved through a gathered crowd like a current through water. Eyes finding them, people turning, the couple nearest the door, the group beside the fireplace, the woman in rose silk near the window who stopped mid-sentence and did not resume. Daphne kept walking. She had learned to keep walking. She had learned it in solicitors' offices and cramped boarding houses and narrow stairwells and the daily, grinding labor of appearing smaller than she was. She was not going to unlearn it in 30 seconds, simply because 30 strangers were looking at her. Beside her, Augusta steered them both toward the center of the room, with the directness of a ship that had a destination, and was not interested in obstacles. She stopped when she reached the cluster of guests nearest the fireplace, near enough that her voice would carry to most of the room. "Lady Heswick," she said, addressing an older woman in gray, who had been Augusta's acquaintance for 40 years, and who had the useful quality of paying close attention to whatever Augusta did. "May I introduce?" Augusta paused. Not long. One deliberate breath. "Lady Daphne Ravenscroft, daughter of the late Baron Ravenscroft, of this house." The last three words landed in the room the way a stone landed in still water, not loudly, but with weight. Lady Heswick's eyes moved to Daphne, to the gray dress, to the pearl earrings, to her face. Something moved in the older woman's expression, recognition, or the beginning of it. "Ravenscroft," she said carefully. "I knew your mother." "Many people did," Daphne said. "She was easy to know." Lady Heswick looked at her for a moment longer. "You have her manner." "I'm told I have her stubbornness as well," Daphne said. Lady Heswick smiled, a real smile, not a performed one. Augusta accepted a glass of wine from a passing footman with the expression of someone who had laid a careful bet and was watching the board. The whisper began almost immediately. Daphne could hear it moving through the room the way she had heard it move through other rooms. Fragments, not sentences, the particular murmur of people adjusting their understanding of a situation they thought they had already understood. "Ravenscroft, the daughter. Did you know? Augusta brought her, in this house." She kept her face composed. She was very good at composed. She had been practicing for 2 years. Then she heard her name, not her name, the borrowed name, from behind her. "Miss Darrow." She turned. Felicity Cranbourne had crossed the room with the economy of movement of a woman who had something to say and wanted to say it before circumstances changed. She was beautiful in a deliberate way, dressed in ivory, as women who expected to be the subject of an announcement often chose. She had used the false name deliberately. Daphne noted this without expression. "Miss Cranbourne," Daphne said. What a surprise. Felicity's smile was precisely calibrated, too warm to challenge openly, too controlled to be genuine. "I wasn't aware Lady Pelham's arrangements included additional guests." "Lady Pelham's arrangements include what she decides they include," Daphne said pleasantly. "I believe that's always been true of her." A beat. "Of course," Felicity said, "though I do wonder how you came to be available this evening. I had thought you had other obligations." She left the word obligations a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "I rearranged them," Daphne said. Felicity's smile held. She glanced at the gray dress. "You must have come very quickly." "I came as I was," Daphne said. "I find that sufficient most evenings." 3 feet to their left, Augusta made a sound that was almost certainly not a cough. Felicity looked at Daphne for one more moment. The look of a woman recalculating something she had thought was already settled, and then turned away with the particular grace of someone who intended to revisit this conversation at a moment of their own choosing. Daphne watched her go. Then she turned, without hurrying, and looked across the room. Everard Thornley was standing near the far window. She had seen him before, twice in the corridor, once in the kitchen garden, once at the village church in the autumn, always at a distance, never directly. She had arranged it that way. He was not attending to the conversation happening around him. He was looking at her. She had expected recognition to be gradual, a flicker, then a pause, then the slow arithmetic of a man working out what he was seeing. But something in his expression suggested the arithmetic was moving faster than she had anticipated. He had the look of a man who had asked himself a question and was deeply uncomfortable with the answer already forming. Daphne held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she turned back to Lady Heswick, who had begun describing a recent journey, and she listened as though she had no other interest in the world. She felt him cross the room before she saw him move. Not romantically, she was careful about that kind of thinking, had been careful for a long time. It was simpler than that. The quality of someone's attention arriving in your vicinity. She had felt it from solicitors and landlords and men who wanted things from her and men who wanted things for her. And this version of it was different from all of them. Lady Ravenscroft. She turned. He was closer than she had expected, taller than he had looked at a distance. She had the sudden, dislocating awareness that they were standing in the room she had grown up in, and that he had arranged the furniture differently. "Your Grace," she said, "I wasn't told you were expected this evening," a statement constructed to be a question. "I wasn't expected," she said. "I came with Lady Pelham." He looked at her for a moment. "You've been in this house for some weeks," he said, "under another name." "A borrowed one," she said. It seemed simpler at the time. "Simpler," he repeated. Something moved in his face. "Your father designed the schoolroom in the East Wing." She was quiet for a moment. She had not expected him to say that. "He spoke of it," she said carefully. "He never had the funds." "I found the original plans in the estate records," he said. "His handwriting." She said nothing. "I followed them," he said, "as exactly as I could." The fire behind her shifted, settling. From across the room she could hear Felicity's voice, light and carrying, directing someone's attention towards something else entirely. "You hold something," he said, more quietly now. "My solicitor mentioned it. A discrepancy in the title, an affidavit that should have been filed and wasn't." "Yes," Daphne said. "You've held it for 2 years." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "Why?" She considered giving him the clean answer. She had given the clean answer before. It was true as far as it went. But standing in the room with the pale green wallpaper just above them, she decided she was done with the clean answer. "I came back to see it once more," she said. "I thought that would be enough. Then I saw the East Wing. I watched the children arrive in the mornings." She stopped. "I couldn't undo something that was doing good, even if it was mine to undo." He did not speak immediately. She found she was glad he didn't. She had been given immediate responses before, in offices and drawing rooms, and the various sterile spaces where women explained their situations to men who had already made up their minds. She preferred a man who let a thing settle before deciding what to do with it. "Miss Cranbourne arranged to have your name removed from the staff list this evening," he said finally. "The steward told Mrs. Garwood," Daphne said. "Mrs. Garwood told the cook." "You knew." "I knew." "And you came anyway." "Lady Pelham asked me," she said. "And I thought." She paused and allowed herself an honesty that had no clean version. "I thought that if this was going to be the last time I stood in this room, I would rather stand in it as myself." The announcement was made at 9:30. Daphne had known it was coming. The library maid had mentioned it that morning. The Duke planned to announce the engagement over dessert. She had sat with that information, as she always sat with difficult information, still and quietly, until she had decided what to do with it. She had decided to come anyway. She watched it from near the door. The Duke rose. The room assembled itself around him with the practiced attention of people accustomed to listening to announcements in rooms like this. Felicity stood at his side, composed, radiant, already arranged for the occasion. He spoke briefly, with the controlled eloquence of a man who had chosen his words, and he said the things that were expected of him, and the room applauded. Daphne set down her wineglass on the side table. She set it down carefully, without a sound. Then she walked to the entrance hall, retrieved her coat from the footman, who had taken it on arrival, and went out through the front door. Augusta's coachman was waiting. She had not sent for him. He had simply been there, because Augusta planned carefully, and Augusta's staff were efficient, and Augusta did not send people into difficult evenings without ensuring they had a way home. She did not look back at the house. She got into the carriage and sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the lit windows recede as the carriage moved down the drive. It was exactly what she had expected. She had walked in knowing what would happen, and she had walked in anyway, because walking in had been the choice she could live with. She had been Lady Daphne Ravenscroft in her mother's house for approximately 45 minutes, and no one could take that back from her, and she had said the things that were true, and she had not been small. It was enough. She told herself it was enough. 3 days later, a letter arrived at her lodgings in town, forwarded from Ravenscroft Hall through Augusta. The letter was 4 lines in a hand she recognized. Lady Ravenscroft, I have engaged a solicitor to review the affidavit and its implications. I would ask that you receive me at your convenience, not to discuss the matter of the estate, though it must also be discussed, but to address something that is owed to you separately, and that I am not prepared to leave addressed by letter alone. Thornley. She read it twice. She thought about a man who had followed her father's handwritten plans to build a schoolroom no one asked him to build, and who had come to the reception in that same house and heard her say something difficult and let it sit before he answered. She thought about the way he had said her name across the drawing room. Not Miss Darrow, her borrowed name, the woman she had invented to make herself acceptable, but Lady Ravenscroft, her own name, in her own house, without theatrics. She picked up her pen. She wrote 4 words. She sealed the envelope and sent it before she could write a second version. He came the next morning in a plain carriage, without the Thornley crest. He knocked at the door himself rather than sending his card up first, which the landlady, Mrs. Copeland, mentioned to Daphne on the stairs with an expression suggesting she had revised her opinion of dukes generally. He came in. He stood in her sitting room, small, cold, with an uneven bookshelf and a writing desk and nothing of particular note, and he looked at it with the same attention he had brought to the Ravenscroft drawing room. I owe you an apology, he said, that I don't fully know how to give because the injury was done to you before I arrived in the story. It was done by Gerald, she said, and compounded by everyone who didn't look closely enough, he said, including me. She did not answer. The fire was small but warm. Outside the window, the November Street went about its business. The solicitor says the affidavit is sound, he said. The sale can be contested. The hall can be returned to you. I know, she said. That's not why you held it. No, she said, it isn't. He was quiet. He had the look of a man preparing to say something he had written several versions of and had ultimately decided to say without any of them. The engagement is dissolved, he said. The arrangement was sensible, not honest. It's better ended cleanly. He paused. I would like to discuss what to do about the hall. Together, if you're willing. That will require a solicitor, she said. Yes, I'm aware. He held her gaze. I would also like to discuss other things that don't require a solicitor. At your convenience. A pause. Always at your convenience. She looked at him. She thought about a man who had come to her lodgings in a plain carriage and knocked on the door himself, and who had found her father's plans in an estate archive and used them without credit, and who, when she told him something difficult, had let it sit before he answered. She stood. She crossed the small room to the door that led to the landing. She held it open and looked back at him. There's a better room downstairs, she said. Warmer. Mrs. Copeland doesn't charge extra for the front parlor on weekday mornings. She paused. If you'd like to continue. He picked up his hat from the side table where he had set it. He looked at her. The same steady attention she had first felt across the drawing room of her mother's house. And then he set the hat back down. He wouldn't need it. Not for a while. They went downstairs together, and Mrs. Copeland, who was absolutely not listening from the kitchen, heard everything, and put the kettle on for the second time that morning, with the expression of a woman who had formed a firm opinion the day. This guest arrived on her doorstep and was finding, to her considerable satisfaction, that she had been exactly right.